They could hardly believe it. The boulder had actually killed the great white shark. But their joy lasted less than 3 seconds before panic set in again, because there were still a few ferocious great white sharks in the water, ready to attack at any moment, and there were no more loose boulders on the cliff above. On this tiny island, barely 10 square meters in size and with no place to stand, how would the two women trapped on the raft escape? Just a few hours earlier, they had been flying with a group of friends on a seaplane, heading to a small island for a vacation. But just as they were about to reach their destination, the plane crashed unexpectedly. The moment it hit the water, the plane disintegrated and sank into the ocean. Lindsey was the first to surface, anxiously scanning the area for any sign of her friends. To her horror, she saw a massive shark slowly swimming past her. Lindsey was too terrified to make a sound. Fortunately, the shark had no interest in attacking her and soon disappeared below the surface. It was then that her friend Kahaya surfaced, followed by her boyfriend Seb. They were all lucky to have survived. However, 3 others, including the pilot, were still unaccounted for. Suddenly, Seb noticed something. They swam over and found the pilot, barely alive. Lindsey was about to ask him if there was any hope of rescue when the pilot lost consciousness due to his severe injuries. Luckily, Kahaya found an inflatable life raft, and Lindsey quickly went to help. But they hadn't noticed a shark rapidly closing in, and in an instant, it dragged the pilot away. By the time they managed to climb into the kayak, the pilot was already gone. It was then that Seb spotted a small island in the distance. The island was their original destination, and since the pilot had mentioned there would be supplies, Seb decided to go alone and send out a distress signal. Lindsey immediately jumped into the water to stop him, warning him about the sharks. But Seb didn't take her word for it. Just as they were talking, 3 sharks suddenly appeared on the surface, swimming straight toward them.
Oh my... You guys...
The ferocious great whites attacked Seb, tearing into him. The water turned red with blood in an instant. Lindsey was terrified and quickly turned to swim toward the kayak, but the sharks were closing in fast. It seemed like she would be next to meet her fate, but then Lindsey came up with a bold idea. She abruptly stopped and grabbed onto a floating object. Confused, Kahaya urged her to swim over. Just as Kahaya thought Lindsey had been devoured, Lindsey swam up safely from the other side. But the danger wasn't over yet. A shark lunged at Lindsey again, and she desperately swam toward the kayak. Fortunately, just as the shark was about to strike, Kahaya managed to pull Lindsey into the kayak. Just as they breathed a sigh of relief, another shark suddenly charged at the kayak, and they were instantly thrown into the sea. Kahaya quickly handed the dagger to Lindsey, and they positioned themselves back to back to defend against the next shark attack. But in the next second, Kahaya was dragged underwater by a shark. Sensing something was wrong, Lindsey turned around only to see Kahaya being torn apart by the shark. Helpless, she could only swim back to the kayak. But the shark wasn't done with Lindsey. Once again, Lindsey narrowly escaped death. But the sharks in the water continued to watch her closely. Knowing that she couldn't survive much longer like this, she desperately began to paddle the kayak away. Her only hope now was to reach the nearby island. Just then, Lindsey spotted a figure floating in the water. It was her other companion, Evan. Lindsey quickly swam over to check, but no matter how much she shouted, Evan didn't respond. When she managed to pull Evan's body aboard, she realized that his lower half was already missing, clearly the work of the sharks. Before she could even mourn, the vicious sharks reappeared, snatching the body from her hands. Having already lost her boyfriend and friend, Lindsey was on the verge of total collapse. But the sharks didn't give her a moment to breathe. It leapt from the water and violently bit down on the kayak. This bite tore straight through the kayak. As the air rapidly escaped, Lindsey had no choice but to paddle desperately toward the island, but her strength was quickly fading, and the kayak deflated completely. Worse yet, 3 sharks were now launching a full-scale attack. With no other choice, Lindsey abandoned the kayak. Fortunately, the island was within reach. Lindsey dove into the water and swam desperately toward the raft. The sharks missed their target, but quickly locked onto Lindsey's position. Lindsey narrowly escaped once more. She quickly opened the supply box on the raft and found food and water inside. To her surprise, there was also a walkie-talkie, though no one responded to her calls for help. Next, Lindsey found a flare gun. Without hesitation, she loaded it and fired a flare into the sky, praying that a passing boat would notice. As she anxiously waited for rescue, she suddenly noticed the last surviving companion, Paige, drifting toward the island with the waves. Surprisingly, Paige hadn't been attacked by the sharks. She had only suffered a minor leg injury during the crash. However, just as Lindsey threw a rope into the water to pull Paige aboard the raft, the sharks reappeared. Luckily, they narrowly avoided another attack. The sharks, unsuccessful this time, disappeared back beneath the surface. Learning that everyone except Lindsey had become shark food, Paige was overwhelmed with grief. After Lindsey bandaged Paige's leg, they suddenly heard a man's voice coming from the walkie-talkie. Someone had heard Lindsey's distress call and was now approaching in a speedboat. When they learned there were sharks in the water, they immediately stopped and began to stand guard with spear guns. Lindsey and Paige, seeing this, immediately panicked and shouted for them to ignore the sharks and focus on rescuing them first. But as soon as they spoke, disaster struck. A shark suddenly rammed the speedboat with great force, knocking one of the men off balance, and he fell straight into the water. The other man tried to reach out and save him, but a shark leaped out of the water and bit off his arm. He too lost his balance and plunged into the water. In an instant, both men became food for the sharks, devoured completely. Watching their hope of rescue vanish before their eyes, Lindsey and Paige were overwhelmed with despair. The sharks, however, were still circling nearby, waiting for another opportunity to attack. At that moment, Lindsey and Paige realized they couldn't just wait for death. They had to do something to kill the sharks and swim to the nearby speedboat if they had any chance of survival. Paige looked up and immediately came up with a plan to kill the sharks. On the cliff above, there was a large rock teetering on the edge. They could tie a rope around it, slap the water to lure the sharks, and then use the rock to crush them. But no matter how much noise Lindsey made, the clever sharks refused to take the bait. With no other choice, Lindsey decided to be the bait herself. She jumped into the water to lure the sharks. Soon enough, the 3 sharks swam towards her as expected. At the moment they got close, Lindsey quickly scrambled back onto the raft. Paige, seizing the opportunity, pulled the rock down. With their synchronized efforts, they successfully crushed one shark. But there was no time to celebrate. 2 more sharks were still circling, and the cliff had no more loose rocks to use. Just when they didn't know what to do next, they noticed the spear guns from the 2 men drifting toward them. To get the spear guns, they quickly grabbed 2 rocks, soaked them in the blood from their wounds, and tossed them into the water. Once the sharks were distracted, Lindsey dove into the water to retrieve the spear guns. But just as she grabbed the spear gun, a shark suddenly turned and swam towards her. Paige, frantic on the raft, urged Lindsey to hurry back. The shark was too fast, and before Lindsey could climb back onto the raft, it was already closing in. In a desperate move, Paige couldn't wait any longer. She grabbed the dagger and jumped into the water. After a fierce struggle, the shark clamped down on Paige's thigh. In the chaos, her dagger accidentally stabbed the shark in the eye, allowing her to narrowly escape. Lindsey and Paige supported each other as they quickly climbed back onto the raft. But Paige's leg injury was too severe, and the supply box no longer had any bandages left. Despite Lindsey's efforts to stop the bleeding, Paige eventually succumbed to blood loss and died. The death of her last companion filled Lindsey with rage. She channeled her grief into determination, ready to fight the shark to the death. Lindsey took out the gasoline from the supply box, tied a rope to the box, and attached the other end to the spear gun. She then sat on the raft, raised the spear gun, and began splashing the water with her legs to attract the shark. It didn't take long for the noise to capture their attention. As the shark leaped out of the water to attack, Lindsey quickly returned to the raft and fired the spear gun. With perfect aim, the harpoon hit the shark's mouth. Seeing that the shark was successfully trapped, Lindsey hurriedly poured gasoline around it and then grabbed the flare gun. She aimed at the water's surface and fired. The flare ignited the gasoline, and the fire rapidly engulfed the shark. After struggling for a moment, the shark was completely still. But just as Lindsey basked in her victory, the last shark suddenly lunged from the water and dragged Paige's body beneath the surface. After a brief moment of sorrow, Lindsey realized this was her chance to escape. She immediately dove into the water and swam toward the nearby speedboat. However, before she could reach it, the shark was right on her tail. In a split second, Lindsey once again narrowly avoided death. The shark, frustrated at losing its prey, began ramming the speedboat, attempting to knock Lindsey into the water just like before. Lindsey tried to start the boat and flee, but the engine wouldn't turn over. At that moment, she spotted an oxygen tank in the cabin and suddenly had a bold idea. At this moment, the shark continued to ram the speedboat, seemingly determined to catch its prey on board. Meanwhile, Lindsey taped a knife to the bottom of the oxygen tank, holding a wrench in her right hand as she crouched in the cabin, waiting for the shark's next strike. Sure enough, in the next second, the shark launched another assault. In this way, Lindsey successfully dealt with the last shark. Exhilarated by her victory and survival, Lindsey couldn't believe she had actually done it. Even luckier, a rescue boat arrived just then, and she was finally able to escape the terrifying nightmare. Follow me for more exciting content!